All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something that I think you're really interested in.
Yeah.
And that's the role of carbohydrates in rehydration,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially after exercise.
Especially after exercise.
You
Right?
bet.
Yeah.
We hear so much about electrolytes,
Right.
but you sent over some fascinating research on this.
I did.
And I have to admit, I'm pretty excited to dig into this with you.
Yeah. It's a really interesting area.
Yeah.
We hear so much about the electrolytes when it comes to rehydration, but
Right.
the role of carbs might be a little bit more important than we realize.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
We're looking at a study from Virginia Tech.
Okay.
And get this,
Mm-hmm.
the Gatorade Sports Science Institute.
Wow. Okay. So straight to the source.
Talk about going right to the source.
Yeah.
So they basically wanted to figure out if adding carbs to an electrolyte drink
Right.
would make any difference in how much fluid your body actually holds on to.
Yeah. And they found that it does.
Really?
Yeah. So this study involved a group of trained men
Right.
who were intentionally dehydrated through exercise.
Yeah.
And then they were given different beverages,
Okay.
all with the same electrolyte concentration,
All right.
but with varying levels of carbohydrates.
Okay.
So 0%, 3%, 6%, and 12%.
So they were isolating the effect of carbs.
Exactly.
That's good.
It's like a scientific puzzle, right?
Yeah.
You got to make sure you're only changing one piece at a time to really see what happens.
Exactly. Yeah. Did they find like a magic carb percentage?
Well, here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Across the board, the drinks with carbs and electrolytes
Huh?
led to better fluid retention than plain water.
Really?
Yeah.
Good.
And the 12% carbohydrate beverage actually showed the highest retention rate.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're saying that by adding carbs to like my electrolyte drink,
Yeah.
I could potentially be holding on to significantly more fluid.
That's what the research suggests.
That's a game changer.
Yeah.
What do the researchers think is going on?
Well, there are a few potential mechanisms that they explore.
Okay.
One thought is that higher carbohydrate beverages
Mm-hmm.
take a little bit longer to empty from the stomach.
Okay.
So the fluid gets released into the bloodstream more gradually,
Okay.
which could potentially be aiding that retention.
That's fascinating. Why would slower gastric emptying be beneficial for hydration? I would have thought faster would be better.
Yeah, you would think, right?
Yeah.
But think of it like a time release effect.
Okay.
You're spreading that fluid absorption over a longer period of time.
Got it.
Another theory involves something called blood osmolality.
Okay.
When you consume carbs, your blood sugar increases.
Right.
And this, in turn, can increase blood osmolality.
Okay.
And this might stimulate hormones like vasopressin and insulin,
Okay.
which could play a role in fluid retention.
Okay. I have to admit, I need a little refresher.
Sure.
Remind me, what exactly is osmolality?
It's basically the concentration of particles in your blood.
Right.
So think of it this way. The more stuff dissolved in your blood, the higher the osmolality.
Okay.
And that kind of signals to your body, hey, we need to hold on to more water to dilute things out.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So more carbs, higher blood sugar, higher osmolality, and the body says, hold on to that water.
Got it. That clever.
Exactly. And then there's also
Yeah.
the kind of fascinating concept of glycogen storage to consider.
Okay.
So you know that your muscles store carbs as glycogen, right?
Right.
Well, this process actually requires water.
Oh.
So the researchers wondered if greater glycogen storage
Yeah.
might also contribute to better overall fluid retention.
Wow. So our muscles are like little sponges soaking up water along with those carbs.
It seems that way.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
It seems like carbs could be playing a role in hydration on multiple levels.
That's what the evidence is suggesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
However, there's still more to unravel, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the mystery continues.
The mystery continues.
But even with these unanswered questions,
Sure.
it seems clear that there's more to hydration than just chugging electrolytes.
Right.
The type and amount of carbs we consume might also be playing a crucial role,
Absolutely.
especially after exercise.
Especially after exercise. Yeah.
Now, this research was done on trained athletes
Right.
who were intentionally dehydrated.
Yes.
So it makes me wonder how this applies to the average person who
Yeah.
might not be training at that level.
That is a great question.
I mean, does this mean we should all be adding carbs to our water bottles after a light jog?
Well, that's something we can explore next.
Okay.
This study doesn't directly answer that question,
Okay.
but it does open up some really interesting avenues for future research.
All right. So let's talk about how these findings might apply to everyday life coming up next.
Sounds good.
All right.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about this study on athletes and, they were intentionally dehydrated
Right.
through exercise and how adding carbs to their drinks seemed to boost their hydration.
Mm-hmm.
But, it makes me wonder, how much does this apply to the average person?
Right.
Someone like me.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly training for a marathon here.
Sure.
Should I be worried about,
Yeah.
adding carbs to my drinks after a casual walk?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's, something researchers are still trying to figure out.
Okay.
This study gives us a really fascinating piece of the puzzle,
Okay.
but it doesn't paint the whole picture.
So we can't just extrapolate these findings to everyone.
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Remember, these athletes were also heat acclimated,
Right.
meaning their bodies were already used to performing in hot conditions.
Okay.
And that could be a factor too.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
So heat plays a role in how our bodies use carbs for hydration.
It could.
Oh, interesting.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
We have to consider all sorts of individual differences.
Age, fitness level,
Right.
overall health,
Right.
even the type of exercise you're doing.
Okay.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So it's not as simple as saying everyone needs carbs for hydration.
Exactly.
It's more nuanced than that.
It's definitely more nuanced.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of research do we need to see next?
Well, for starters, I think we need to look at different populations.
Okay.
What happens when we repeat this study with, women,
Right.
older adults,
Yeah.
people who aren't as highly trained?
Got it.
Would we see the same results?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about different types of exercise.
Sure.
This study used a combination of cycling, running, and elliptical training.
Right.
Would the results be the same if someone was lifting weights or swimming or doing yoga?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
And then we have to think about the types of carbs.
Okay.
This study used a specific mix of sucrose, glucose, and fructose.
Could other types of carbs, like complex carbohydrates, have different effects on hydration?
So many variables to consider.
So many variables.
Yeah.
It sounds like we have a lot more to learn about this whole carb hydration connection.
We do.
Yeah, we do.
And that's why this study is so valuable, right?
Absolutely.
It's like a stepping stone to a deeper understanding.
It is.
But even with all these unanswered questions, I think there are still some, key takeaways we can apply right now.
I agree.
Like what?
Well, I think first and foremost,
Yeah.
it challenges the assumption that hydration is a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
We can't just assume that drinking enough water is enough,
Right.
especially after exercise.
It makes you think twice about reaching for that plain water bottle, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of paying attention to our individual needs.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for someone else.
It also makes me wonder if we've been focusing too much on electrolytes. This study didn't find a big difference between the placebo with electrolytes and plain water.
Right, it's true.
So does this mean all those sports drinks I've been chugging
Yeah.
after workouts might have been missing a key ingredient?
It's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
While electrolytes are definitely important,
Mm-hmm.
this study suggests that they might not be the sole driver of fluid retention.
Okay.
It seems like the magic happens when you combine carbs and electrolytes.
That's a real game changer.
It is.
It makes me want to go back and look at the labels of all my sports drinks now and see what kind of carbs they're packing.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of how this research can help us make more informed choices about our hydration.
I'm also curious about the details of the study itself.
Sure.
You mentioned they were very careful to control the participants' diets
Right.
to make sure the results were actually about the carbs
Yeah.
and not some other dietary factor.
Exactly.
Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. So for 24 hours before each trial,
Okay.
they gave the participants a standardized diet.
So they made sure everyone was eating the same things.
Exactly.
That seems pretty intense.
It does sound that way.
Yeah.
But remember, they were trying to eliminate any variables that could skew the results.
Okay, that makes sense.
They even went so far as to make sure all the beverages were flavored and matched for taste.
Really?
And they served them cold.
Why all that effort?
Because things like flavor and temperature can influence how much we drink.
Oh. Yeah.
They wanted to be absolutely certain that any differences in fluid retention were due to the carbs, not because one drink tasted better than another.
Okay.
It's all about scientific rigor.
I never thought about all those little details.
Yeah.
It's like a whole other layer of the experiment
It is.
that I never even considered.
It is.
Wow. Now back to those fascinating findings.
Sure.
Um, I remember you mentioned that the 12% carb drink led to the highest fluid retention.
Mm,
But even the 3 and 6% drinks did better than plain water.
that's right.
So does that mean more carbs always equals better hydration?
Well, it does seem like there might be a dose-response relationship there.
Okay.
More carbs, better hydration, at least to a certain point.
Okay.
But remember, this was a relatively small study,
Right.
and we need more research to confirm that
Okay.
and figure out if there's an upper limit.
Right.
Maybe there's a point where adding more carbs doesn't provide any additional benefit.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about something you mentioned earlier,
Sure.
that there wasn't much difference between the placebo with electrolytes and plain water.
Right.
So does that mean electrolytes aren't doing anything at all?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean they're useless,
Okay.
but it does suggest that they might not be the sole factor driving fluid retention.
Okay.
It seems like it's the combination of carbs and electrolytes that really makes a difference.
That's a game changer.
It is.
It makes me wonder if all those sports drinks I've been chugging after workouts haven't been doing the full job.
It's definitely something to consider.
Maybe they need more carbs.
And it's a great reminder to always read labels
Right.
and choose drinks that meet your individual needs.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture takeaways, but now I'm curious about the nitty-gritty.
Sure.
Did the researchers happen to notice any, negative side effects of those high-carb beverages?
That's an important question.
Yeah.
And thankfully, they did assess gastrointestinal comfort throughout the study.
Okay.
They were looking for any signs of discomfort or digestive issues.
So what did they find? Did all those carbs cause any problems?
Interestingly, they didn't find any significant differences in reported discomfort between the different beverage groups.
Wow, that's surprising. I would have thought all those carbs might lead to some stomach upset, especially in the 12% group.
It's understandable to assume that.
Yeah.
But remember, these were trained athletes. They're used to consuming a lot of carbs as part of their training.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So for these athletes, even the highest carb drink was well tolerated.
It seems that way.
I guess it's a reminder that individual tolerance can vary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always a good idea to listen to your body
I
and
know.
see how you feel.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has been?
We've covered so much ground already,
We have.
from the study design and findings to the bigger implications and even the limitations.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts on this study?
I think the most important message
Yeah.
is that carbohydrate intake might play a much bigger role in hydration than we previously thought.
Okay.
And this is especially true after exercise,
Right.
when our bodies need to rehydrate and replenish.
And it's not just about chugging any old sports drink.
Right.
The type and amount of carbs seem to matter too.
Exactly.
It's about making informed choices. But before we completely wrap up,
Sure.
I want to look a little closer at some of the limitations of this study.
Okay.
Because the researchers were very upfront about acknowledging that more research is needed.
Right.
We'll dive into that after a quick break. So we're back, and we were talking about some of the limitations of this study on carbs and hydration.
Right.
And, even though the results were really interesting,
Yes.
the researchers themselves were very upfront about acknowledging that,
Yeah.
more research is needed in certain areas.
Absolutely.
So what were some of the specific areas where they thought,
Yeah.
maybe we need to do a little bit more digging?
Well, one of the key limitations they pointed out was relying solely on body mass change as the indicator of hydration status.
Oh,
It's a very common method, but it's not a perfect one.
okay. I have to admit, I'm a little bit surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
I would have thought that weight change
Yeah.
would be a pretty straightforward way to track
Yeah.
how much fluid someone's retaining or losing.
It might seem straightforward,
Yeah.
but you have to remember that a lot of other factors can influence body mass, besides just changes in fluid levels.
Yeah.
Things like shifts in glycogen stored,
Okay.
bowel movements, even the air we exhale
Really?
can all affect our weight.
Wow.
So it's not a foolproof indicator of fluid shifts alone.
So even with all those dietary and exercise controls they put in place,
Right.
there's still a chance that those body mass measurements
Right.
weren't perfectly reflecting actual hydration levels.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. And there was another interesting point that they brought up,
Yeah.
and that was the fact that the total amount of carbs each participant consumed
No.
actually varied a bit from person to person.
It did.
I thought they were giving everyone drinks with like specific carb percentages.
They were.
So why would the total intake vary?
The amount of beverage each person drank
Okay.
was determined by how much weight they lost during exercise. Ah, I see.
So someone who sweated more and lost more weight
Mm-hmm.
would end up drinking a larger volume of the beverage
Got it.
and therefore consuming more total carbs.
That makes sense.
Right.
So even though everyone was getting the same concentration of carbs,
Right.
the total amount they were taking in varied a bit.
Exactly.
So did the researchers try to account for that variation
They
in
did.
their analysis?
They did. They used some statistical methods to try to control for those differences in total carb intake.
Okay.
But they did acknowledge that it's still a potential source of error.
Okay.
And they even suggested that future studies might want to try a slightly different approach,
Okay.
using a fixed volume of water for rehydration
Okay.
and then adding varying amounts of carbs to that fixed volume.
Got it.
That way everyone's consuming the same amount of fluid,
Right.
just with different carb concentrations.
That's a really interesting suggestion.
Yeah.
Were there any other limitations that kind of stuck out to you? Well, they also mentioned that they didn't directly measure
Okay.
some of the physiological processes that they were interested in,
Mm-hmm.
like gastric emptying or intestinal absorption.
So while they had some strong theories about how those mechanisms might be playing a role,
Right.
in the results, they couldn't actually confirm those theories
Yeah.
with direct measurements in this study.
Exactly. And of course,
Yeah.
they acknowledged the need for longer-term studies to
Mhm.
really see how consistently consuming a certain amount of carbs might affect hydration status over time,
Okay.
rather than just looking at the immediate effects after a single exercise session.
So it sounds like, we've got a lot more to learn
We do.
about this whole complex relationship
Absolutely.
between carbs and hydration.
It's fascinating.
But even with all these limitations,
Yeah.
I still think that this research is, incredibly valuable.
It is.
It's really challenging the conventional wisdom,
Yeah.
and giving us like a whole new way to think about how we hydrate.
I completely agree. It's a fantastic example of how science is always evolving,
Right.
and how even seemingly simple things like hydration
Yeah.
can be much more nuanced than we initially thought.
Well said.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say is the most important message
Yeah.
for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the key takeaway is that hydration isn't just about drinking enough fluids.
Okay.
It's also about what you're drinking
Right.
and how that interacts with your body's unique needs.
Right.
And this research really suggests that carbohydrates might play a much bigger role in that equation than we previously realized.
Absolutely. It's time to ditch the one-size-fits-all approach to hydration.
Yes.
And start thinking more critically about what we're putting into our bodies.
Yes.
Especially after exercise.
Especially after exercise.
Absolutely. So pay attention to how your body responds.
Yes.
Experiment with different types and amounts of carbs.
Yes.
And of course, stay curious.
Stay curious.
And keep learning about the latest scientific findings.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It counts.
I've learned so much. I really appreciate your expertise.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. And remember, stay hydrated,
Stay hydrated.
stay curious,
Stay curious.
and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.